And that's it. Like, that's how it's going to work, is each discrete individual has to go through a process of really deep work on their own individual capacity to show up in every dimension, cognitively, emotionally, perceptually, and exploring possible modalities of reality that our conventional models of reality we don't have really good names for, or we don't even think exist because we don't know. And then secondarily, learning then how to use that individual capacity to increasingly come into faster, deeper, and more coherent communion in groups. And I should mention, by the way, that in the practices that we've done so far, every geometry is qualitatively different. So dyads are different than triads, and triads are different than fours, etc.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I wanted to rewind a little bit to what you said at the beginning. Can you talk a bit more about the global collapse that we're going through right now and the war that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. So let me put it into a framework first, and then talk about the pragmatics. So the framework looks like this. I think everybody alive who has any degree of self-awareness notices that sometimes they're at the top of their game and sometimes they're not. If you've been driving all night, you had a bad choice for dinner, you haven't slept, you drank too much coffee, your likelihood of doing things that you don't think are wise later is much higher than if you're well-resourced, right? So, of course, that fact, that sort of metaphor is happening broadly all over the world. Every minute of every day and everybody's interactions with each other and with the world is increasingly pushing us into states where we're making worse and worse choices. For example, I have recently fully unplugged from social media because social media is almost completely toxic, which is to say that when I go into any social media environment, I find myself decreasingly capable of making good choices and increasingly willing to make bad choices because it has that effect.
Wow.
Now, this is an interesting problem because we've got billions of people who are now connected on social media. And by the way, I don't just mean social media. Think also broadcast media. If I read an article in the New York Times, there's a 99% chance that I'm worse off rather than better off. Books, particularly old books, by the way, are things that we can still rely on because they take so long to write and to read. They have this cool concept called, what's the word? Slipped my mind. But the term has to do with a differential time element. So books are slower than other things. And so they'll actually present a different framework for sense making than things that happen in real time. So by the way, that's a good mechanism. If you're feeling really, really demoralized, unplug from real time information and plug into a great book from, say, the 19th century. And that'll actually help you build back up capacity. All right, so that's one. So what's happening is the mechanism by which we collaborate right now, the tools and techniques by which our information flows, our sense-making frameworks are really fucked up. And they're making us emotionally less capable of responding to reality. And they're actually breaking down our cognitive capacity as well. Like, you just look at the choice-making, decision-making that's happening. You guys are not in the U.S., so I don't know what's going on and where you are. But I can tell you, the United States is in the process of going insane in every direction. I mean insane almost like in a technical term, meaning increasingly incapable of actually perceiving or responding to reality and dropping into lower and lower levels of pragmatic sovereignty. And just like in a family where everybody's getting tired and cranky, people start itching for a fight. And when somebody starts pushing because they're just itching for a fight, that just pushes other people. And so we're kind of eating the seed corn of civility. Now, that's one side. Other side, reality is getting harder to deal with. The global financial system is now a full decade into a completely delusional, false sense of stability, where every single piece of it is becoming more and more fragile across the board. Ecosystems we're now deeply into the environment where climate change and the consequences thereof are actually having pragmatic effects. Decreasing crop yields, decreasing freshwater reserves at the edges. It's not yet so obviously catastrophic that everybody's aware of it, but if you actually see where the sensitive locations are, say like Syria last year, you can see the absolute immediate consequences of those effects, and then that has a cascade effect, tapping into the fact that all the most fragile nation states, the ones that have the highest degree of fragility and tension and lowest reserves, are now beginning to fail, and the externalizing their own instability into the environment around them, which creates increasing tension on the other environments. So, for example, the flow of refugees out of Syria are now impacting, say, France and Italy, which are themselves already going through like 3 different levels of challenge: economic, demographic, their own internal cultural dissonance the impact of social media and technology on underlying frameworks. Like all these different variables are playing back on each other. And so net, what we have is basically two distinct forces that are happening simultaneously. On the one hand, our individual and collective capacities to make good choices in the world are decreasing because the tools that we have are actually pushing us in a negative direction. And on the other hand, the stuff we have to deal with is getting more and more present and more urgent and more intense. So this is going to lead us into a situation where we're going to make extremely bad choices because we're using bad heuristics. I'll give you a concrete example. And by the way, this is not just a purely theoretical example. The United States right now is in a classic scenario where good strategies from the past 1,000 years would say that we're facing a choice between significant civil unrest, which in principle could very easily transition to some kind of civil war, although we don't know exactly what that would look like. Things don't ever look the same over and over again, but very significant civil unrest, which traditionally the Machiavellian response to that is pick some sort of other outside of adequate threat, pick a fight with them so as to generate coherence internally. All right, we're all familiar with that basic approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm sitting in charge of maintaining the integrity of the United States and I watch it begin to fall apart into civil unrest and increasingly accelerating towards something which smacks a lot like civil war, I might choose to say, okay, I'm going to pick a fight with somebody of adequate threat. And I don't think North Korea is enough. That would cause the people inside to say, oh boy, this is a real shit. That we have to put our differences to the side and rally around the flag so as to protect ourselves from the external threat. Or at least give me the ability to impose the level of internal discipline, sometimes known as martial law, to just quash civil dissent internally. Now that playbook has been played for thousands of years. I'm not making that up, and it's not magic. Like lots and lots of people understand that, both intuitively and consciously. So one, the fact that tells us that it's likely to occur. Two, I happen to know that those conversations are being had. But then three, and here's the sneaky part, that playbook is no longer valid. The set of tools that worked, even all the way up into the late 20th century, no longer apply in our contemporary environment. So this loops us all the way back to the failure of sense-making. If I'm a strategic decision maker at the level of nation states, I've got a sense-making model that includes the techniques that I just mentioned that unfortunately are obsolete, but I don't know they're obsolete, which means that I'm going to be making choices based upon an obsolete set of models without knowing that they're obsolete, which means I'm making increasingly bad choices and maybe becoming increasingly confused as to why they're bad choices, which means then I have a choice. Either I double down, I commit myself to my sense-making model and assume that my confusion is bad signal, or I accept the fact that I don't know what's going on and start double-checking on my sense-making model. Now, what do human beings tend to do in that scenario?
Assume the world is crazy and they're insane.
They're right. Yeah.
That is correct. That's not a bad choice. Like from an evolutionary perspective, the phrase "always wrong" or "often wrong but never in doubt" is actually a good strategy, except for when it's not. And now is when it's not.